Welcome to the Hidden Truth Show podcast. I'm Jim Breslow. We're doing a deep dive into the transgender movement. What you're about to see is an interview that I did with Aydin Olson-Kennedy. He is the executive director of the Los Angeles Gender Clinic. He is a transgender man, married to a woman, and the stepfather to her child. It's a far-ranging discussion that I think you'll enjoy. Check it out. And if you want to hear the rest of the podcast, check out Hidden Truth Show Podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts.
But that's a problematic even place to come from, because we actually don't look for causation for things that we generally celebrate and that we don't have negative feelings about. We look for causation of homosexuality, but we did not look for causation of heterosexuality. We look for causation for trans experience, but we don't look for causation for cisgender experience. And so I think that even the starting point, the premise, there's a lot of just to be critical of that starting point, that what we kind of universally actually do know is that gender identity as an experience lives in the brain. And that I'm not saying that there's trans folks who haven't experienced trauma. Sadly, unfortunately, far too many have experienced trauma. But if trauma in and of itself was a predicting factor for trans experience, our numbers of trans people would be way, way higher, because we know that roughly 1 in 3 women experience significant sexual trauma, and that doesn't translate to the numbers of trans folks. In LA, it's estimated, based on the Williams Institute, there's conservatively probably about 175,000 trans adults, and somewhere around 26,000 trans youth under the age of 18. If it was trauma-based, those numbers would be so much higher. Is there a coincidence of trans folks and LGBT folks in general who experience trauma? Sure, but it's not causation.
Well, but you're saying that pretty definitively. I mean, so as you sit here today, what's the cause of gender dysphoria and ultimately transgenderism?
Well, it's an incongruence of gender identity and gender experience, right? But your congruency as a cisgender person is that your assigned sex does match your internal sense of gender identity. Mine as a trans person did not. That there's no root of trauma that is around that, any more than trauma, if you will, caused your gender identity. Gender identity is an innate experience, just like sexuality.
Okay, but what is the cause of our gender identity?
It lives in our brain. We don't know the cause of either cisgender or transgender. It lives in our brain.
And that's what I'm in agreement with you on. The bottom line is we don't know.
But we do know, with a lot of research and a lot of data, we actually have a lot of clarity that there's no evidence to point that it is trauma related. So the absence of evidence doesn't mean that it does exist.
Yeah, no, look, I'm of the mind that we don't know. And most experts would say it's probably some combination of nature and nurture.
What experts?
Just generally speaking, I'm not going to cite somebody right now, but if you're
going to put something forth like that, I actually think that you do have an accountability to cite it, because what you're talking about is profoundly dangerous rhetoric for the community. It's really, really dangerous.
So you do, just to be clear, so you absolutely believe born this way?
Yes.
Okay.
I absolutely do, both as a person, but somebody who is, I've been working with trans folks and families for well over 10 years. I've at least 1,000 people that I've worked with, and each individual person's experience is unique, and there are absolutely commonalities. There's absolutely threads that run through people across the age span who have gender dysphoria, and it would be irresponsible for me to not sort of acknowledge of, like, wow, look at the theme that runs through those thousands of people, and my colleagues and professionals, they travel all over the world doing this work, and you get a group of us at the table, and we're all going to be able to identify the themes that run through the experiences of people with gender dysphoria. How it shows up is going to be individual, but there's themes.
And I want to talk more about that, because you're far more expert than me. There's no doubt about that. But I do want to go back to this point that you saying, me making that statement that it could be nature and nurture is dangerous, because what I believe is that simply because you're not born this way doesn't mean that the person should not be loved, respected, accepted, not discriminated against. There seems to be this dichotomy that people think that either you're born this way or it was a choice. But let me just finish, sorry. That you're either born this way or it's a choice. I'm like, wait a minute. I'm not saying it's a choice. I don't think gays choose to be gay, and I don't think trans people choose to be trans. But I'm not convinced that you're born this way. I think it's very possible that there could be something that happens either in the womb or at a very young age or what have you, that affects things, that could affect sexual identity, could affect sexual orientation. And so, and maybe it causes changes to the brain, but it happens at such an early age that, no, it's not a choice. So that could be correct. I want to separate out things that people don't like to hear because they want to be fully accepted as, say, born this way from just finding out the truth. My show's about trying to find the truth. And just to finish my point, I think absolutely trans and gay should be loved, accepted, and everything else, whether you're born this way or whether it happens in early childhood. It makes no difference to me.
May not make difference to you, but it actually makes a huge difference to a lot of folks.
But it shouldn't.
Well, should or shouldn't. We could spend a lot of time in that.
But shouldn't overall the truth be the most important thing?
But the truth is subjective. You're trying to put forth a truth that I don't share, that I don't agree with, and so whose truth are we talking about?
Well, I don't think truth is subjective. I think, and we're not going to figure it out today, and I'm not saying that I'm right, and I know you're not saying that you're right, because neither of us, as we sit here today, no. But truth is the truth. I mean, bottom line is, for any particular individual, and maybe more broadly, there is some reason why you are trans. We don't know what that is. It could be some wiring in the brain. It could be DNA. It could be something that happened. But
why does it have to be something that happened? Did something happen to you? Have you spent any time or energy, if you've engaged in a conversation with anyone that required you or forced you to think about the origin, why you are not trans?
Well, we could go to evolution and say
but why do you get evolution and I don't?
Well, you're being trans is an exception if we're going to evolution, because if people were trans, then evolution wouldn't have gone the way it did, right? So
no, that's based on the premise that people are not procreating. Like trans folks are not carrying children, having children, genetically contributing to children.
Well, they're able to have children now because of modern medicine.
No, but trans people have been having children as carrying children, genetically contributing to children for a long time. A long time.
Okay, well, let me ask it this way. Gender dysphoria, which used to be called gender identity disorder, and they changed it because they say that it's not a disorder. But bottom line is, gender dysphoria is something that requires treatment. People don't, in a happy manner, generally live with gender dysphoria. Typically, it's treated, and ultimately one of the treatments may be transition. But it is something that needs to be treated. And how it should be treated, I think, is an important question. And what is the cause of it? You need to know what the cause of it is before you can
I disagree.
treat it.
You don't need to know the cause of it.
No?
There's a million things that we provide treatment for that we don't know the cause of. There's so many things that we medically, that psychologically, that we don't spend time and energy looking at causation. What we say is like, oh, this is a place in which you are struggling. This is a place in which you need support. This is a place in which you need intervention. And so that's the starting point, and we figure out how to maximize the quality of that person's life. We actually don't know the causation for a tremendous amount of things that people seek medical and mental health care for.
Well, but all the better if you do know, because then you would know you'd be wasting your time with certain treatments, right? So better to know. So for instance, if you're born this way and somebody comes to you and says, gee, I'd like to get counseling to not be trans, you would say, well, gee, Johnny, you were born trans, so the best thing for you to do is to follow this course and not this course.
That is such a narrative reduced. That's just not how people practice.
Well, because we don't know the answer right now.
Okay. Well, we're not going to agree, and we're falling down a bit of a rabbit hole here.
Yeah.
And so I think that maybe is there something else we can move on to? Because this is not something that I don't feel like you had somebody else on the show. You have whatever sort of personal interactions or experience that you've had with the trans community, and the reality is like you have your perspective, you have your opinions, and you have your probably very narrow database that you're sort of speaking from, and I'm not saying that this database that you have is not accurately represented from this perspective. It may be 100% accurately represented from the folks and the community and the access points that you have. It happens to not be an accurate representation of the data set that I have.
So just go ahead and share with me your data set and your feelings and what you've learned from living this much longer than I have. I mean, I'll say this many times. You are the expert. I'm not the expert. I'm coming from a layman's perspective, trying to understand something and help an audience understand something. But share with me, please, what you've learned through your practice.
Well, I feel like I already have. Like the reality is that when we look at understanding where gender identity lives for people, there is sort of within the professional and scientific community, there's a general understanding that it lives somewhere in the brain. We don't know where, but we sort of have this like understanding, universal understanding, because when we look at the overall numbers of people who are not trans, we just have the basic assumption that it lives somewhere in the brain. Identity in general, sexuality, gender identity lives in the brain, right? And if you're not trans, like we all just sort of happily go along and accept that to be true. If you're trans, and not so much now, but definitely back in the day, if you were anything other than heterosexual, then there was dialogue of like, well, what caused this and where does this live and what gene does this live on in the DNA? And we spent a lot of time and energy there. And thankfully we've largely moved away from, that's not valuable. That's actually not valuable. It's not helpful. If somebody comes in and they have gender dysphoria, they themselves, like some people go through a process in the coming in where they're like, what's the origin of this? Like what's happening? But most people find pretty quickly there's no value. There's no value for them. I don't think that there's a lot of value for there to be a tremendous amount of dollars and time and energy spent researching that question, when the reality is like if people need care, they need care. It doesn't really matter where or why or how, but if people need care, they need care. And for some folks, that care is going to be transition. For other folks, that care will not be transition. And if you are a good ethical provider, you're creating space for both in all of the other scenarios that I haven't talked about.
If you enjoyed that part of the interview, listen to the entire interview on the Hidden Truth Show podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Jim Breslow.